All right. So here we are in the dark times. Um, the wetness has returned, and we're so lucky to have water, clean and fresh water. So tonight I wanted to talk about um, some of the early teachings. One of the challenges that we all face when we come to Zen is to figure out where all the teachings fit. So I want to share a portion of this orientation in my talk tonight. It's partial because the teachings and the whole system of teaching and tradition is vast and wide. But tonight I'll talk about an aspect of it that's not talked about so much in the Zen world, which are the earliest teachings, the Buddhist, but not necessarily Zen, which was a much more recent development. Although the roots of Zen are inherent in conscious living. We should remember that that Buddhism is a tradition that is 2,600 years old. It's not 200 years old. It's not 400 years old. It's not 800 or 1,000 years old, or even 2,000 years old. It's 2,500 years old, 2,600. And it started with Shakyamuni Buddha, who is the first modern Buddha, meaning the first Buddha in historical time, not mythic, because there were previous Buddhas that we only know through the mythic stories. Shakyamuni Buddha, aka Gautama Buddha, who is known also as Siddhartha Gautama, before he awoke, before he realized what he realized about the nature of self. So I'm going through these, I'm filling in some of the details, because you can have practiced for a long time and still wonder what some of the terms are. And it takes a while to fill it all in. So with sources so old, we should remember that we are receiving history and myth together, beautifully and mysteriously integrated. Stories that are woven over time through many tellings, coming to us in translation through several other languages, from the original Pali, a language that was used to write down the teachings that were orally transmitted. And the language that the Buddha and his followers spoke was not even Pali. So there are a lot of places in which the teachings can take on different flavors. And as we look at teachings from more recent times, and then they refer back to some of the earlier ones, we can find a lot of variability. So it's no wonder that most of us are a bit confused about Buddhist teachings. But the more we study, the more we can clarify some of this. The collected teachings are called the Pali Canon. And of course, Pali is the language that they were written down in. And a canon is a collection of sacred books. So it's the Pali Canon. When you hear a teaching from the Pali Canon, you know it's from some of the original teachings. They're also, and these teachings are from the time of the Buddha or just after the Buddha's life, and they are referred to as the Tripitaka. Have people heard that term, Tripitaka? Yeah, so you may have heard it, and that's what this refers to. They were written down well after the Buddha's death. And they were recorded as remembered by, a lot of it was remembered by Ananda, who was the Buddha's cousin and his close companion through much of his life, much of his teaching life. They were also set down by others, close disciples that were, and then also disciples of disciples. So over the course of a couple of 100 years, these teachings were set down at several different councils that were held to record the teachings. So many monks would gather and recite, repeat and record what was generally maintained through oral recitation as the primary practice of a lot of the monks. There was meditation, but recitation was an important part of the practice early on. So this is an oral history written down after the fact. Many of these teachings were chanted regularly. They were chanted regularly by the old ones, who were known to us as the Theravadan elders. And Theravada, which is the early form of Buddhism, is the way of the elders. It was how teachings and the guidance of the teachings were spread, was orally mostly in the early days. Now I'm talking about this because it's very possible to practice for a long time and have no idea about the origin of this tradition. And it's helpful when thinking about how we adapt teachings to our own time and circumstances, to know something about what the circumstances and times were like that they came out of. So today we say that formal Buddhist practice has three legs: meditation, which is what most people identify as the whole practice; ethics, which are the precepts; and study. And we who are in the Sangha and regularly attend do a lot of studying together in various ways. Studying that helps us develop discernment about what the Dharma is really about, what it's getting at. And also getting familiar with the terminology, which has very specific meanings and helps us really pay very careful attention and not take for granted that we understand in our usual terms what a lot of the teachings are about. So it's fascinating and it's instructive in important ways to take a look at some of the original teachings. And we have some of these in our library at the Zen Center, and I urge everybody to come and spend some time looking through some of the canon. As we read through it, we become really aware that the teachings were offered in a time that was as complex a human milieu as we are in today, with the exception that they weren't saturated by media the way we are. Media that can really obscure our ability to be very present and to be really aware. And we have so much media that entrances us and that gives us an impression that the world is a certain way. We hear it, we see it, repeated over and over again. So we have to work our way through that. Whereas in the time of the Buddha, the media went only so far as hearsay. There were rumors, and it was told, which was a little bit simpler a situation. So the Tripitaka, it means three baskets. And the first of the three baskets is the Sutta Pitaka, which are the sermons and background materials for from the Buddha and his main disciples. And these articulate the basic teachings. And then there are the rules for the outward life, which is called the Vinaya Pitaka, or the Vinaya, the rules for the Bikus and Bikunis. And then the third basket is the Abhidhamma, which is a psychology of mind. It came forward, actually, it was already present at the time of the Buddha. It came to him down through 2,000 years of Vedantic teachings before the life of the Buddha. So actually, the roots of the Abhidhamma are over 5,000 years old. And it was originally in a much more rudimentary form, but was really amplified by the Buddha and especially the Sangha, the Sangha of practitioners and Bikus and monks who came after the Buddha. There's a lot of argument about the categories, and the Abhidhamma is really interesting. And it's subject for another talk because there's a lot in it, and I didn't want to just be too brief about it. But tonight, what I'm going to talk about a little bit more is the Vinaya Pitaka, which lays out the regulations for the outward life of the Bikus and Bikunis. You may have heard these terms, Biku and Bikuni. They are the ordained followers of Buddha Gautama. There are still those orders of Bikus and Bikunis, and they take on the full Vinaya precepts. In our tradition, we take on 18, but if you take on the full precepts from the Vinaya and become a Biku or a Bikuni, as a Biku, you take on 227 precepts, 227 rules for comportment, for how to behave. And in the Vinaya, it lays out all of these and the stories about how they came forward. Initially, when the Buddha awoke, there were no rules. There were just no rules. But as a community gathered, more and more situations came up that needed to be addressed by the Buddha. And so the rule was born so that people could live in some semblance of order and peaceability together. So the Bikus kept 227 precepts, and Bikunis, the women, who had to really argue their way into ordination in a way that the Bikus did not, were given 311 precepts. And most of the additional precepts that, if not all, that the women kept had to do with serving the Bikus and entering a room after the Bikus and eating after the Bikus and giving the best food to the Bikus. And even a Bikuni who had many, many years of awakened life deferred to a Biku who was 20 years old and just ordained. So there was incredible imbalance in the Buddhist Sangha, which reflected the culture, actually, which was absolutely patriarchal. So in preparation for a seminar that we just completed, I've been delving into the Vinaya texts. For the first time, I was surprised when I got to them, because it's very thick and it's very detailed, and I just was never very interested in old rules. But I was so taken by surprise by how much is to be learned in these ancient stories and instructions about our own challenges as a Sangha. Actually, the situation has not changed. Following the Buddha way requires us, just like them, to take responsibility for the well-being of the Sangha. In the early part of the Vinaya, we have the story of the first turning of the wheel. You may have heard that phrase, the first turning of the wheel, have you? The second turning of the wheel? Well, the first turning of the wheel is comprised of the first teachings that the Buddha gave 49 days after his awakening. He gave them to the 5 ascetics who he had shared the path with for a number of years, previous to deciding that he had to find a way to really settle his question about the nature of his life and self. So he began by giving these teachings to these 5 ascetics. And he began, because they were ascetics, he began with a teaching of the middle way. The way that's between extreme asceticism and sensual indulgence. And so right off the bat, he started teaching exactly what was needed to the people who came to him. And that characterized his whole career as a teacher, which was more than 40 years. He always had a sense of the most direct teaching that was needed by the audience that he was addressing. And then he went on to teach the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering and problems and difficulty and dissatisfaction, the truth that it is, it all gathers around clinging and grasping, that energy that we all experience. The third of the truths, of course, is that there is a way to free ourselves, to find some liberation amongst all this. And then the fourth noble truth is the path and the specific ways that we do that. So that's the Noble Eightfold Path. The first turning of the wheel of the Dharma are the foundational teachings that we explore as our own map for awakening. We come back to them all the time. Whenever situations in our life arise that are confusing or difficult, we can always come back to these basic teachings. And I think of how often I come back to the first noble truth, which is the truth of the suffering that's inherent in samsara. And the subtlety of that teaching. When we have a life of practice, we think that our practice is going to solve all our problems. That's not what's meant there. But that we can see the source, we can see how these arise, and we can open the mind and heart even when we are in the midst of difficult conditions. We broaden the view immensely and are released from the clinging energies. So these are the foundational teachings, and they form the basis for Buddhism. Zen teachings came much later and have a different emphasis, and they grew out of the teachings on the open nature of all experience and the immediate presence, really tuning into our moment by moment by moment experience of now, which is the only experience we ever have, is right now. So that's Zen. You don't have to be a Buddhist to practice Zen. But that's another talk. So back to the early teachings in the Vinaya. Following the Buddha way requires us to take responsibility for the well-being of the Sangha. And the Sangha really figures large in the early teachings. It's really easy to focus all of our energy in our practice on our own confusions and difficulties and dramas and Dharma ambitions, and lose sight of how our behaviors affect other people. And as some of you have or will have a sustained practice over many years, this focus manifesting our awakening in the Sangha is, and how we contribute our awakening, our awakened mind and our open heart, contributes to an atmosphere of kindness and honesty and stick-to-itiveness in the Sangha and also out in the community at large. We don't have ordained forms. We don't keep monastic forms, but we are ordained into our lives. And this is especially true for those who take formal vows known as jukai. And anybody with a rakusu, such as some of us are wearing, have received the 16 precepts and formally entered a commitment to the Buddha way. And this commitment is about serving all of life by being very sensitive and caring about how we show up in relation to other people. So these vows are really important in our Sangha. And we keep them only to the extent that we are aware of what's involved in maintaining the Sangha and the center. And the extent to which we commit ourselves to helping maintain the center. Maintaining the center and also the Dharma. So one way we say this is, first, we practice for ourselves. After a while, we practice for the sake of the Sangha. And then finally, we move into practicing for the sake of the Dharma. Because it has come down to us all through all of these 2,600 years from people like us who practiced and kept it alive, brought it to life. So the Vinaya offers a guiding hand here that stretches back through the ancient times and over great distances. The cultural conditions there were vastly different. The human conditions, the human mind and heart, the obstacles to being clear and caring are exactly the ones that we contend with. Greed, a feeling of lack, of not enough, anger, and ignorance about our true condition. And these conditions run through our lives. These are the three poisons: greed, hostility, and ignorance. And we are entirely interdependent. And we create suffering, personal suffering and suffering in the world, to the extent that we're blind to our interdependence. So this is all the teachings that are found right at the very beginning. We in all things are impermanent. And to the extent that we don't respect this and we act carelessly, we miss a precious opportunity to appreciate all of our moments, all of our companions, all of the things of the world, and the continual poignant circumstances that we all share with everything that lives, and stems from the fleeting nature of our days. I just wanted to share a poem by Merwin. As I was reading along, I remembered this poem. Thank you, my lifelong afternoon, late in this season of no age. Thank you for my windows above the river. Thank you for the true love you brought me to when it was time at last, and for words that come out of silence and take me by surprise, and have carried me through the clear day without once turning to look at me. Thank you for friends and long echoes of them. And for those mistakes that were only mine. Thank you for those mistakes that were only mine. For the homesickness that guides the young plovers from somewhere they loved before they woke into it to another place. They loved before they ever saw it. Thank you, whole body and hand and eye. Thank you for sights and moments known only to me, who will not see them again, except in my mind's eye where they have not changed. Thank you for showing me the morning stars and for the dogs who are guiding me. It so beautifully expresses our life when we're really awake in the moment, every moment, not wasting it. Mostly every moment. I don't know. Sometimes we lose it. Interdependence, impermanence, and no self. No permanent self. No single unchanging self. Even every cell of the body changes and is replaced over time. You may notice that in your own body, or maybe not yet. This person, no self, this wonderful, is such a wonderful koan that this tradition insists on us investigating ceaselessly. And the Buddha lays out in the early teachings in very specific descriptions. There are many stories in the Vinaya that tell us how certain rules came about. Words and narratives, what we experience, how we talk about it, weaves the lessons and points to what my teacher, Robert Aitken, called the perennial teachings. Teachings that are always true and are not conditioned by conditions. So one story I wanted to share before I finish is the story of Devadatta, in case you are not familiar with it. And actually there are many versions of this, and even in the Vinaya, there are a number of versions. So that's where myth and historic reporting cross over. We don't really know. But the story of Devadatta reminds us that even our worst enemies, and maybe especially our worst enemies, are our greatest bodhisattva teachings and teachers, because they live out of a wrong view. And at the moment, we are surrounded by these bodhisattva teachers. Wrong view, which is not dislodged by practice and isn't seen through a sense of great determination to see through our views, which we all do. That's what we're about, is seeing what is delusion in our own experience. And all we have to look to is where we are suffering, and right there is to be discovered a lot of sources of delusion. So now Devadatta was Ananda's brother, and he was always jealous of his cousin Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha was very kind, he was very smart, he was handsome, well-loved, and he was the beloved child of the king, and destined to inherit the kingdom. So Devadatta was seized from early days in his life with jealousy. There were a number of stories about his jealousy and how he acted it out in his childhood. And then what occurs a few years later, when he brings this habit, his habits of ambition and jealousy and hostility, and acts them out in the Sangha, and which caused schisms in the Sangha a couple of different times, as he strove to outdo his cousin and broke one of the precepts, which is not to misrepresent one's own spiritual attainment. And when he did that, he alienated 500 of the Buddhist monks and took them and left the Sangha. So he was expelled, but he also expelled himself. Devadatta left with 500 monks, complaining that the Buddha was lax in his discipline. And he formed his own Sangha. So this suggests the 10th precept, which is not to do anything with our body, speech, or mind to cause the Sangha to break, but to do everything to support and strengthen the community. And we can apply that not just to our Sangha, but to our community. How do we comport ourselves in a way that really supports peacemaking and connection and diminishes alienation? Because there are a lot of behaviors that really increase a sense of alienation. Well, not only did Devadatta do this, but he also tried to murder the Buddha by dislodging a boulder that would trample him, but somehow the Buddha evaded that. It didn't work. And then Devadatta tried poisoning him with some poison brambles. And the story goes that what happened instead was that Devadatta fell into these brambles, fell into them, and was reborn in a hell realm. And if you've ever fallen into brambles, you know how quickly you are reborn into a hell realm. Anyway, these stories are all in the Vinaya, but you can see they're not sequential. So who knows, but they're all based in something. And then there's another instance where Devadatta encouraged his friend Ajatashatru, the son of King Bimbisara, to kill his own father, which he did, so that he could inherit the kingdom of Magadha. So these are examples of what was going on then in the Buddhist Sangha and the kind of confusion that plays out today in various modern Sanghas, not to this extent, but there have been many instances that come close, actually. There are instances where a person is asked to leave the Sangha, but everything is done to try to have that not happen. Because our commitment is to encourage people to wake up and do everything we can toward that. So this means that our practice is, an important part of our practice is to learn how to work with conflict skillfully. Conflict, which is inevitable in human groups, but to be skillful, to be patient, and to keep in mind our intention to bring forth understanding from conflict rather than alienation. So these are just some comments about, and I hope I didn't go on too long, about the Vinaya Pitaka and the wealth of rules that are, some of which are very amusing, like don't stuff your cheeks full of food is one of them. Good to know. Try not to do that. So I hope this was of some interest and maybe gave you a little bit of orientation to where this tradition started out and some of its contours early on. And may we all practice together well and find liberation from all of our worried and troubled mind and heart.